let's posit that at the time that the Bhagavad Gita was a bestseller in ancient India, right? This was like the standard textbook that would be read by every student during their formative years in order to prepare them for the challenges of life, right? At the time, it wasn't a process of individuation being described, but the process. But I write A now because we're reading the Gita not at the beginning of Kali Yuga, but at the end. And since that time, many different alterations of the process have been suggested and mandated by various cultural shifts that produced movements in relation to the question of individuation as the goal of life, okay? Even the meaning of the word individuation at that time bears little resemblance to how that signifier was used more recently by Carl Jung, for example, or how that term is used by cognitive therapists or many existential or analytic philosophers of the 20th, 21st century, etc. So we need to understand what is meant by individuation as the goal of life, and what is this process? This original process, let's call this one the primal standard process. And as we analyze it, we will discover that it's in the particular challenge that individuation faces us with that was the crossroads of the ancient world. In other words, every culture was dealing with that question. And so we can see the similarity, for example, of how the Greeks dealt with it, how the Abrahamic religions and especially later Christianity reacted to it and modified it, how it was dealt with. Even the difference that developed between the Vedic yogis and the Buddhist yogis. And of course, there was another answer or variant by the Taoist yogis. But at this point, there was an agreement of what individuation was about, even though there were different approaches to its practical achievement, okay? So what is meant by individuation in the Gita? It's expressed by that painting that I showed you, by the scene that occurs in the first chapter of the Gita, which is the agreement of Arjuna to give the reins of his chariot to Krishna, right? So what does that symbolically mean, and what did it mean to the people who were taught the Gita 3,000 years ago? Arjuna was the individual consciousness of the character identified with the body. Krishna symbolizes, let's say, even now, the Godhead. All right? So within his chariot, in other words, his temple, his cranium, was the individual character as a center of consciousness, and a second center, which was the consciousness of what we in that last retreat referred to as the fundamental mind. The Greeks would call it the nous, the mind of God. The Buddhists might have called it the Buddha mind, or nirvana, or emptiness, or suchness, or the Tathagata Garbha, depending on the particular school within that tradition. And of course, Shiva within the Shaiva tradition. Or Shakti within the Shakta tradition. So what we're dealing with in this symbol is the understanding that we have both a particular self and a universal self. But somehow they have become separated. They have become split apart. They are two different centers. And so long as they are two different centers, there will be a wavering in how the individual center functions, depending on changes in its relationship to this second center. So what does individuation mean? The word itself means to become undivided. That means that the individual self of the character and the supreme self, the infinite self, must be indivisible. They must be united in a way that they can no longer be sundered. They can no longer be separated. That's individuation. When you can say, I and the Father are one, or Shivoham, or however it gets expressed in the different traditions. It's the same concept. That's individuation. And life doesn't begin until that has been attained, that union. This is why Ramana is always speaking of our problem is split mind, right? We even have a split mind rock, right? So we remember that our minds, the split must be healed. It must be overcome. Well, that's what the Gita is instructing us to do. But that instruction, after a certain amount of time, no longer worked practically. At least it worked for fewer and fewer disciples of that approach. And so that's what caused the split between approaches, not just between West and East, but between ascetic and tantric, for example, Vedic and the Buddhist approach, and the all the various splits in wisdom schools to accommodate the various shifts in the intensity, density, and assemblage point level of consciousness in the cultural norms of that particular era in which a new modality would have to be invented in order to be able to serve the population in a practical way. And this is why the wheel of Dharma had to turn so many times in in Buddhism. And it also, we can explain why it didn't turn properly in many of the other traditions. So let's just approach it from where we left off, which, as far as I remember, was chapter 2, and we were on verse 38. I think that's where we stopped, but even if it isn't, that's where I want to start, because I think this verse is the bedrock of the Gita. This is the statement of the problem or the challenge. Okay? Now remember, when people were reading this, they understood very clearly that Arjuna represented everyone, every human, every character. And Krishna is in the cranium of every character, but not every character recognizes that fact and is seeking individuation. That's the only thing that separates Arjuna from everyone else, is Arjuna is conscious of the fact of that split and of the need to heal that split. The urgency of healing it, because he will not be able to deal with the challenges of the battle he faces ahead if he doesn't accomplish this now. Okay? That's the spiritual emergency that Arjuna realized he was in, and why then the instructions could work. But if you don't realize you're in that situation, none of this text will have any value for you. You have to recognize that you are facing an equally challenging battle that cannot be avoided, despite all of those 10 defense mechanisms that we know don't work. They don't work when the battle starts, at least. So here's the verse. This is Krishna giving what I would say is the core instruction to Arjuna. Holding pleasure and pain to be alike. Likewise, gain and loss, victory and defeat. Then engage in battle. Thus you shall not incur evil. Okay. What do I have to do? Arjuna gets the word. All I have to do is realize that pleasure and pain are the same. They're not different. That's easy. And victory and defeat are not different. Success and failure are not different. Gain and loss are not different. Is that possible? Are you able to be in that state of consciousness where that is true? I don't think it's possible any longer for the current ego structure that has been manufactured in the 20th and 21st centuries, as we quaintly call this period. It has nothing to do really with those numbers. But this was what everyone was called upon to achieve. So the question I will ask you, and I think everyone needs to answer two questions about this. One is it feasible to be in that state where there's literally no difference between pleasure and pain? Is that possible phenomenologically, psychologically, practically? And if it is possible but not actualized, how important would it be for you to reach that state? Would you even want to be in that state? It's interesting, in the Hermetic tradition of the West, and in the West, I think that the core mainstream esoteric teaching tradition is that of Hermeticism. We'll go much more into that as we approach the differences between East and West in regard to this question. But what they said is that the teaching of the Torah, the Bible, the Pentateuch, call it what you will, is accurate in Breshith, in Genesis. And that is that history, human history, can be divided into a before and after. Before Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge, or let's call it belief in good and evil, and after, right? Now, the before was kind of dealt with as if it wasn't a lot of time, and most of history is the aftermath. In the East, it's the reverse, and it says, no, that we didn't start eating that apple until halfway through the cycle of time. We had thousands of years in that state where we had not touched the concept of good and evil. It did not arise in our minds that there was not only a difference between good and evil, but the concepts, the words good and evil, did not exist. Okay? Now, that state was defined in the Bible as a state of total innocence. Whereas in the aftermath, in your mind, when you have taken in that belief as an axiom, then your entire consciousness is dyed by that belief. And I think the word dyed has many different aspects to the signifier, but it has definitely been colored by it. It's been darkened. And in fact, this is really the original meaning of why Krishna was called Sham Sundar, dark and yet beautiful, because he started out as the god prior to the eating of that forbidden fruit, but also had to go through the period after, when he was blue. Remember, Shiva's throat turns blue, but not the rest of him, and then he's able to transform the poison into nectar. But it's this darkness of the belief in good and evil that will always bring about a state of guilt, of self-judgment, that will then undermine the capacity to achieve individuation. The judgment of God as superego will now act as the wall that separates you from yourself. But interestingly, I think we are now in a period of after the after. We are in that period of post good and evil. So to me, we are returning again to the original innocence. But the way that the beyond of good and evil shows up today is in the rule of psychopaths who have become dominant in the civilizational hierarchies. And for them, there's no difference between good and evil. They can do anything they want. And people are starting to get very scared about that because the psychopaths now controlling the nuclear buttons are clearly tending to activate that which most would consider evil if they still have those values separated. But if that aspect of the undifferentiation of good and evil is taking place on the dark side, it also means that it's available as the original state of innocence as well. Because both polarities always appear simultaneously. And that's why the upper death drive is accessible also as never before, even though the lower is more normative and more magnetically drawing of the ego in its current state. And you know, the most recent philosopher, well, not most recent, but the philosopher who in a sense injected this concern into modern philosophy was Nietzsche, who also recognized time as circular, and he has the whole theory of the eternal return. But what he says, and what was later emphasized and even recast by Gilles Deleuze in his famous book Nietzsche and Philosophy, is that what happens to the egos at the end of time, because of this psychopathy, they become reactive. In the beginning, the level of the ego is one of an active agent of that infinite consciousness. And so the will to yoga, to unity, to individuation was magnetically powerful and couldn't be pulled apart. But now we have a world in which the egos have become atheistic and nihilistic. And nihilism is the ultimate state of weakness of the ego, meaning it cannot draw itself out of the quicksand of negativity and self-judgment that comes with that, and it cannot feel itself worthy of or even open to the facing of the possibility of individuation, which would, of course, shatter, dissolve its nihilistic identifications. And so the narcissistic ego pushes away the very intense power of individuation that is on offer. So the separation creates a challenge, because in a way, this is what the Gita battle is about. It's not the army that he's facing that constitutes the battle that Arjuna is in. It's the battle to reach this state of consciousness that has just been described, right? That's the challenge. And then it won't matter what happens in the battle with the other guys, because victory and defeat are not different. And you can only be indifferent to the fate of the bodily organism, even to love your fate, as again Nietzsche said, amor fati, to be able to move into your fate with total empowerment, gung-ho, a berserker in that battle, right? That in which there is no inhibition. But which battle? The battle against your own ego. Have you even begun that battle?